Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. So your host here, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and we welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia SME, after what was a pretty sleepless night because Mr. Putin decided that he was going to have some big news breaking, but it didn't break until the wee hours of, for us anyway, our time. So anyway, a couple of big ticket items over the last 24 hours that are related to each other, and we'll kind of tackle them in a reverse order of how I'm going to talk about it. But first, yesterday or late in the evening, a couple of days ago, there were inklings that the occupied regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts were going to basically accelerate their referenda to become part of Russia proper. Kherson and Zaporizhia had occupied, but and otherwise no other particular status that Russia had recognized. However, Luhansk and Donetsk, if we roll back to the beginning of the war, those were the two areas that Russia had. They recognized their independence basically, and then the war started shortly thereafter. Well, now they're going to have a referenda on joining the Russian Federation formally to become, in Russia's eyes, its own territory. That then led into a announcement that Vladimir Putin was actually going to address the Russian people on this whole thing in person. Was supposed to be yesterday afternoon, last night our time, got rolled into wee hours of the morning our time, which was morning in Far East Russia, I think was the time that he delivered it. And he, among other things we'll talk about here, he announced a partial mobilization for Russian society to support the war effort in Ukraine. We had talked about this in past episodes as something maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. There were a lot of reasons why he had not done it up to that point, but now he's done it, calling up 300,000 reservists to fill the ranks essentially, and there's already been some fallout from that inside Russia, which we'll talk about here. But Yuval, if you want to just take us into starting with the speech, right? What was in the speech? What did Putin say? And potentially as important, what did he not say? What was absent from the speech that you noted?
There's a lot to unpack. So starting basically with the discussion was, as many of them are, a series of grievances and really talking about this conflict as not between Russia and Ukraine. The effect of like what has happened on the battlefield over the past 7 months is for Putin to admit that Ukraine is doing this, is to admit that the Russian army cannot handle Ukraine. So he made very specific references to, we are not fighting against Ukraine, but we are fighting against neo-Nazis. So obviously these are bad people, but we're also fighting against the full military machine of the West. And that's sort of a way to frame for the Russian people what this conflict is about. This is about Russia's sovereignty, its autonomy. Although it invaded the neighbor, the issue is now global in nature. And so, in effect, what Putin described, and this goes into, in essence, the so-called referenda. But I mean, the referenda for the four areas that you mentioned, these are previously scheduled for earlier this month, in September 11th, to coincide with regional elections in Russia. That didn't happen because obviously the counteroffensive changed the priorities for the occupation officials there from holding an election basically to fleeing, which is a much more critical, time-sensitive task when the opposing army is coming in your direction. Then they had wanted to reschedule it for November 4th, which is Unity Day in Russia, sort of a public holiday that previously replaced the commemoration of the revolution and is meant to be sort of an all-civic holiday within Russia. That was also canceled because the counteroffensive is ongoing. So we had at this point the President Putin obviously getting bad news from the field, from the battlefield, getting criticized from military bloggers, former, basically people like talk show guests on TV, as well as politicians at the national level, who all started to criticize Putin from the nationalist right. And that's really the context, because from the nationalist right, what all these people are saying is we need big mobilization. We need to call it a war. We need to not give Russia's victory to the Ukrainians and to the West. Because if we lose basically these areas of what is ours, so to speak, in Ukraine, we're going to feel the effects of that for hundreds of years, etc. So that was the context on the battlefield. The other context was Putin didn't have much success in going west, anything there. So he went to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, and he had a series of humiliations over the course of an entire week. Leaders of China, India, Turkey, and most humiliatingly, Kyrgyz Republic all made him wait when they were going for their photo ops. And even though Putin has lost tens of thousands, perhaps even more of his fellow citizens to a war of choice, doesn't seem to really be perturbed about that in public. But waiting for foreign leaders to leave him just sort of dangling by himself, you could just see him just lose his mind in real time. Fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan, he wasn't able to do very much about that. And the foreign ministers of those countries actually went to New York ahead of the UN General Assembly meeting to broker their ceasefire talks there with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. This followed a visit by Nancy Pelosi to Armenia, which supported to support Armenia in its fight against Azerbaijan. And even though Armenia is part of Russia's collective defense organization. Tajikistan and Kyrgyz Republic, also both members of the Cooperation Security Treaty Organization. They're both members, which is Russia's version of NATO. They're both fighting each other. Russia was unable to do anything from that. Kazakhstan got Xi Jinping to support its territorial integrity. Lots of different bad things were happening. So that's where we get to the context of this speech, in which he says, the news from the battlefield is bad. All of Russia's southern border is basically like on fire, so to speak. They're having to redeploy troops and away from Syria. They're having to move military equipment away from Crimea. All of this then goes into a speech in which he says, actually, we're fighting against NATO. That's the thing. He says, we're fighting against NATO. We're going to do partial mobilization. We're going to organize these referenda just to ensure, just to check whether these people, are interested in Russia. And on that basis, we're going to complete the task of the special military operation. So that is basically one bad week that has now gone into, not going to say it's the final throw of the dice, but when it comes to what, in essence, the so-called referendum mean, it's going to mean that even though they've delayed it twice, they're going to have it this week. And if they have it this week, obviously whatever result that they need, who even knows if they're going to bother even doing anything, they'll just publish whatever result they want. But we're going to get into a situation which is basically the last and sort of final part of Putin's speech, in which he basically is articulating a theory. We're going to create these referenda. We're going to annex these territories directly into the Russian Federation. Because they're now Russia, they have obviously the nuclear defense of Russian nuclear forces behind them. And so if anyone tries to attack it, Ukraine or otherwise, that is an attack on the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation, and we are going to respond in a nuclear fashion. And that's basically his last big threat. That what he's trying to make happen is Western sort of, let's say, lukewarm supporters of Ukraine become more afraid of any nuclear confrontation more than they're interested in supporting Ukraine. And that's his big threat, whether basically the West believes that it's more likely or not that he's going to use nuclear weapons in order to defend even territory that he may not have control over in eastern and southern Ukraine. And I know that's sort of like a lot of stuff to happen at once, but a lot of stuff is happening at once in the situation.
Yeah, indeed. And I sort of got like the Cliff Notes version of his speech when I started reading stuff this morning, and it's definitely, it weaves its way through a lot of different things. His speeches are very dense when it comes to content. All right. So actually, I omitted one thing as well that also happened in the last 24, 48 hours, aside from the speech and the news of the referendum. But that was also news from sort of preceding the speech from the Russian Duma that they were starting to put in some new legal frameworks when it came to a number of things, to include protesting against the war effort, dodging the draft, and then there were additional things that kind of went more after soldiers who were already in uniform, to include something that in the U.S. side we would call it stop loss, but basically for your
Mhm.
contract soldiers who have a 6 month contract, you are now in indefinitely, basically, until the conclusion comes or death takes you. So this. And there was some speculation about what, kind of who the legal framework was aimed at, before we got the news of mobilization. But what's your take on these new laws that have come out as part of the broader mobilization plan now?
So yeah, so I think there's sort of two sort of different things happening at once, and now when we're not trying to describe Putin's no good, very bad week, we can sort of like be a little more steady about this. So as you mentioned, the stop loss effect of and this now there's uh, in the decree that sort of like went with Putin's speech, he basically says that contract, and this is now I'm reading from the translation, contracts for the passage of military service concluded by military personnel continue to be valid until the end of the period of partial mobilization. That means for the guys who have been in the field at this point for 7 months in terms of active fighting, but these are also people who were, doing exercises in Western Russia or in Belarus for perhaps several months before then. They're now there, as you said, until death takes them, or basically they elect to go to prison. Because now the penalty for desertion, the penalty for destroying one's military equipment is 10, 15 years in prison. So that's going to be obviously really bad for morale, because a lot of these people signed up thinking that this was going to be 6 months, whether they signed up out of patriotism, whether they signed up, for the money, which is much more than the average salary. They no longer have any choice. They're probably exhausted. And just in terms of their capability, you know, they've been in there for months. The logistics is not getting any better just because a partial mobilization has been called. So they don't have the stuff in order to basically conduct, conduct the war in a more effective manner. What we can also see is that in terms of what this means for the people who are still in Russia, the way that the decree is set up is that there's several like sort of interesting things here. First, this is going to be done on the provincial level, and the decree calls for basically the governors of these regions to organize in conjunction with the Ministry of Defense the collection of all the various peoples who are either eligible in terms of just their age, but also people who have previous military experience, people who are in the active reserves, and people who might otherwise be, if not voluntold, just straight up dragged off the street in order to go into the war. But here's essentially like the critical aspect, and this is going to cause a lot of difficulties within Russia. There are, in fact, quite a number of loopholes within this mobilization order. The loopholes include age upon reaching the age of military service, which is sort of normal. But here are the big ones: for health reasons. So with people who do not have basically a clean bill of health, they're not going to go into the military. So there's going to be a lot of people, who haven't otherwise fled the country on whatever flight was available, or probably, you know, perhaps even just buy a car and drive to Kazakhstan or Mongolia or whatever. Um, there's going to be a lot of broken limbs that have occurred now and over the next couple of weeks, and those limbs are going to continue to be broken for the next couple of months. And that and there's also one other way to get out of this, which is also to, or several other ways to get out of this. One is to work for the defense armaments industry. So there's going to be, as people leave their jobs in order to be mobilized, a lot of people are going to, try to find industrial work to get out of this. But prisoners are not going to be conscripted. So maybe we're going to have a mini crime spree in the cities of Russia in order to find the alternative to conflict. And so that's going to be part of what we see here. There's going to be the troops already in the field whose morale is already bad, who are now going to be in first wet and then cold trenches for an indefinite period of time. There's going to be a number of people who elected for 6, 7 months to not join the military, who are now going to find themselves and basically going ones and twos in order to basically fill all the different gaps within units. And then you have three people electing various extreme measures just to avoid going into the military, fleeing the country, hurting themselves, finding finding work in the defense armaments industry is basically the best of these, or going to prison. So you're going to have, in effect, a lot of volatility at each part of what's going on. Existing military, soon to be buttressed military, and then basically the people who are left behind. And so in that, what we may think is Putin knows that all of the people who are basically coming up on the expiration of their contracts, they're the ones who are going to be forced to stay. But perhaps all these new people there are going to come and basically do more defensive oriented tasks. And that's going to be the way that they're going to try and improve both defenses and morale at the front by letting them know that more people are coming. But who knows what basically the effect of unmotivated reservists joining the fight is going to do for those who have been in it for 6+ months at this point.
Yeah, so this actually leads into kind of the next question that we had keyed up here, and that's, I wasn't aware of those loopholes, but that I can see a combination of just a terrible decline in national health as well as the crime spree. But so those are the ways that the people people cannot go into the service here. But for those who do go, the ones you can't get away, where are they going to come from? Are there some demographic regional differences that might drive the pool here? And then looking sort of at this force as it becomes constituted, we've hit this in some previous episodes, but there's a lot of questions about, okay, you've got the person, now what? What's the capacity right now for Russia to train mobilization at this scale? Who's going to do the training? What gear is left to give them? And once assuming all that happens in a reasonable time frame, which is a giant assumption that's probably not fully accurate. You had also mentioned in the last episode the time for mobilization to matter was 6 months ago. So now we're looking at from flash to bang another potentially 6 months before these 300,000 who could not find a way to shoot themselves in the foot or go to jail wind up at the front. What impact does this have for the near-term trajectory of the war?
So in terms of the near-term trajectory, it's not going to do very much at all for the reasons that you mentioned. It takes a long time to train people to be effective. Now, it could very well be that their thinking is that they anticipate, once in essence the weather starts turning colder. And I simply do not know. I mean, the Ukrainian military has done a number of basically things bordering on the miraculous over the course of this war, but it's unknown to me right now, and perhaps if share what their cold weather training, what their cold weather capabilities are. Let's assume for the moment that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are anticipating that as of September 21st right now, the fighting in terms of like intensity that we've seen is going to continue for another, let's say, month, 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at the most, given sort of like the weather. Then they anticipate war of attrition and basically people hunkering down for the winter. The best possible scenario for the Russians is that they have whatever they have in the field. They're going to basically get the next couple thousand, perhaps already active reservists to the front in order to basically support defensive warfare at that point, train people over the winter, and then basically when the fighting season resumes in spring, that's when basically all these people will be able to relieve the forces in the field. That's the best possible scenario. The other issues is obviously, as you said, also if the Ukrainians have cold weather capabilities, then basically we're in a very different position as is. But obviously, the Russians have really bad problems with not just training, as what we've seen their performance in the field, but the logistics of getting people to the front, properly equipped, properly motivated, and basically doing combined arms and all that. They don't have the stuff and they don't know how to use it. So it doesn't really matter that they don't know how to use it because they don't have the stuff that they need. So basically, time is a flat circle in that sense. And that is basically like why the mobilization is not going to make much of a difference right now, because it doesn't basically recreate all of the train hubs that have been captured by the Ukrainians. It doesn't change the fact that the Ukrainians are systematically bombing every train line and bridge that the Russians need in order to get supplies to the front in an efficient manner, which is forcing the Russians to bring all of the stuff that they need to the front by truck, which is also what the Ukrainians are basically firing at nonetheless. So again, in terms of changing what's happening on the battlefield right now, not much. Is so that's what makes me think, just like not being like a mobilization expert, is that this is the thing that they think will basically tide them over for maybe a month or two, allow the winter to basically hit more or less a pause, and then come back in spring.
Great. And well, I mean, it's not great, but no, that's kind of what I thought you would get into, because as you said in the last episode, there's a lead time to all of this. In terms of the cold weather operations, I don't want to get too off into sort of speculation here, but I do know that in the last set of aid from the U.S., at least, cold weather gear, personal stuff was part of that package specifically. So they're gonna get U.S. cold weather tops and bottoms and boots and gloves and I'm sure all that stuff. And I don't want to overstate the impact of clothing on operations overall, but I can say from personal experience, we make some pretty good stuff. So I would be much more worried as a Russian soldier about basic stuff like frostbite and hypothermia from my personal equipment than I would be for what we're giving the Ukrainians. And then I don't want to get, this is sort of my JLo's personal opinion here, speculation, but I feel like there a lot of talk about the impact of cold and winter on that area, and certainly historically it had weather as a factor, general winter, right? And I forget the name of the mud specifically that's in that area. Can you remind me? What's that?
Rasputitsa.
Yes, that one. So this is all known, right? I would note that since this war has been ongoing, since 2014, and some of the regions such as Donetsk and Luhansk have been in combat operations for a lot of that period. It's not like the Ukrainians don't know or don't have exposure to full on combat winter operation. I mean, the intensity may be higher now, but they have fought in the winter. And JLo's personal opinion, but I know that since we have been us and a lot of allied nations have been we've been training Ukrainian soldiers in a variety of things. We have some partners and allies who occupy northern regions as well. So there's certainly a depth of practical knowledge that you could draw on to talk about cold weather, combat techniques. And, do both sides hunker down for the winter? I don't know. But I would imagine that, based on that lead time that we just talked about, I don't know that the Ukrainians would, if they didn't absolutely have to, that they would stop their operational tempo for counteroffensives, because they could be 300,000, bedraggled and emaciated souls, coming wearing paper shoes 6 months down the road. But say they do start coming, right? You have a window of opportunity where they're not there yet. And you still want to affect things on the battlefield. And that includes, any effort by Russia to freeze the conflict in the places that they already occupy. Whether or not the referenda go as planned, facts on the battlefield matter. Like, what good is a referenda if you don't own that place anymore? So I don't know. Again, Jayla's personal opinion about whether winter will have an impact, but I could see that there are reasons for sustaining operational tempo as best as you can.
So, and I think that's also like a point to pause on is that we did see at the beginning of this conflict, within like weeks of the war starting in late February, there was evidence, like you and I saw, unfortunately, we saw pictures of Russian soldiers who died of frostbite, which we thought in the 21st century, for that level of basically criminal neglect to one's own soldiers, we shouldn't have been surprised, but we were surprised about that specific thing. And that's going to be, part of the morale issue for the Russian side is there's a lot of people who've been fighting for a long time, and they were otherwise thinking before yesterday or before last week that they were going home, and now they're not allowed to. The people who are coming in are the people who don't want to be there. So that's part of it. And one of the sort of curious things about the decree that that Putin issued at the time of his speech is that one of the points, there's 10 points in the thing. So point number 7, it just says for military use, basically, the Russian euphemism for classified. And in that regard, we don't know basically whether it's, when you ask about demographics, who's going to do this, we don't know if it says like which regions need to provide the most, in terms of like the numbers, which military occupational specialties they're looking for the most. But we do know that there's, in essence, a lack of just about everything. And so what is it that these people are going to do in terms of being able to change what's happening on the battlefield if and when basically the Ukrainians don't stop fighting? They don't stop trying to liberate their own territory. And even if Russia says this part of the country now belongs to us, from the Ukrainians responding by some version of that's essentially your opinion, you need to enforce that. And if you think that basically nuclear extortion is going to get us to stop fighting, well, then that becomes, in essence, a much bigger geopolitical issue. And on that note, we have seen over the past couple of weeks when President Biden, President Macron, like lots of other Western leaders, have very clearly said that their support to Ukraine is not going to decline. And in particular, like President Biden has said to Putin through his interviews, not to use nuclear weapons, because if the use of nuclear weapons is in order to hold on to territories that are gained by basically territorial conquest or annexation, that opens up a Pandora's box of basically the next century of conflict. So we also know that, I would guess, obviously not privy, if Putin does use nuclear extortion in order to try to hold on to these gains, threatening the Ukrainians, the West's response is going to be pretty severe. And in that regard, that may also help shape what the Ukrainians are willing to do on the battlefield, not just now, but even as winter sets in.
Yeah, the whole the conversation of nuclear blackmail and escalation, we may need to do another episode on that, because that's a whole different layer of scary to talk about here. But in terms of the Western, the response, I think that there have been red lines in the past, right, for using weapons of mass destruction, but I think it's fair to characterize that, past uses, for example, in Syria using, chemical weapons, part of the Russian MO, right, is that there is just enough murkiness, plausible deniability, that you could argue, did it happen? Did it not happen? And it'll take months to figure it out anyway. And with that murkiness and plausible deniability, it did not incur the strongest possible response from Western countries. There is no plausible deniability for a mushroom cloud. There's just not. So I would think that knowledge and and sort of that mutual perspective, maybe that acts as a restraint. I don't know, but again, maybe we need to talk about nukes in a totally different episode, because we have a lot of other ground to cover today, and it's a deeper, terrifying conversation. All right, so I want to kind of shift gears and looking at the domestic impact, because as you've noted in past episodes, Putin hasn't done this for a long time for a reason, because there are significant domestic second, third order effects that the admission mobilization was necessary would incur. And interestingly, we're starting to see some of them now. So uh, I saw yesterday and this morning, flights out, like one-way flights out of Russia, are either sold out or they're like super expensive. Prices just, they've climbed by thousands of dollars in the last 24 hours. I believe there was a rule or a law passed that if you're 18, if you're a military age male, 18 to 65, which 65 is a military age male, that's a different discussion. I think we talked about optimal
Yeah.
infantry age in a previous episode. 65, not really it. Anyway, you cannot buy a plane ticket to leave the country if you're a military age male in that demographic. I was watching this morning that there are, lines forming at border crossings going out of Russia. There have been sporadic protests. And so there seems to already be a domestic impact, but what's your assessment of what we've been seeing so far? What else might we see that we haven't seen yet? And what does this do to the likelihood there will be 300,000 people to find even following the mobilization? If this, like in the first 24 hours, is the response of the Russian populace?
I think like the big picture here is that Putin is now in a position that he's worked for many years to not be in, which is events are dictating to him what he has to do. Obviously, from the beginning of the conflict, the Kremlin has had two major messages. If you are super enthusiastic about like politics, then Ukraine are like bad. The Ukrainians are bad people. Ukraine is a bad place. All the sort of like super genocidal talk. Okay. If you are a part of like the grand middle of people who simply do not want to be bothered by this, the conflict is covered as an over there thing and not bothering you thing. And that's been how like the Kremlin has managed this. As scary as you want to be. If you need that adrenaline rush, it's available. If you want to basically just retreat from this, fine. The failures in the field have basically forced Putin to cross those messages, because the criticism from the right that he's giving up Russia's victory to Ukraine simply could not be wished away. And the effect of this is that the thing that he's tried to avoid over the past 7 months, if not longer, is that if you are a normal person in Russia, all you have to do is put the Z sticker on your car, say yes to whatever's asked of you, but nothing important is asked of you. So that you do all of the sort of public displays of loyalty and affirmation without anything actually changing your life. And so what this does is it forces people to actually consider what is going on in the war and what role they might, or their relatives or their friends might have to play. And this is really dangerous, because at this point, whether there's 300,000 people that get called up, or it's, let's say, 5 to 10,000 people who are the right age, have the right military experience, who are active reservists, all that, if it's only a small number and they're unable to actually turn the tide of the war, and there are more and more images of Ukraine winning on the battlefield, that forces Putin into ever more desperate decisions. And this is where basically every autocrat finds himself in at some point. If you don't have a good idea and you keep doubling down, you essentially say, I'm going to gamble for resurrection. I'm going to get out of it with this Hail Mary pass. And if it doesn't work, what's your next one? What's your next one? What's your next one? And that's essentially where I think the people in Russia are more concerned. Not concerned that, like, am I like the person who's going to go have to fight? But if this doesn't work, what is going to be asked of me in 3 months? What is going to be asked of me in 6 months? And it's that fear of the future that is bringing people onto the streets, getting people to flee the country. Whatever the effects on our like the national economy, that's for somebody else. But when people don't have a clear idea of what the plan is and basically what success looks like in a reasonable fashion, that's when they start to freak out. And that's going to be where the Russian state, at the same time that they're basically fighting a foreign war, are going to have to police even more aggressively an entire population at home. And that's going to constrain state capacity just about everywhere.
Indeed, and as you were saying that, I don't want to say that we prognosticated too much, but I think it was back in the very early days of the war, even when there were some sporadic protests, and you had talked about the more aggressive policing. I think we had discussed, at what point does your state policing machine just become a monster that's eating its own tail? Because do you want to keep you want to crack down on the entire country to motivate the others, right? Well, how do you fight a war? How do you keep the lights on? How do you keep the wheels of industry turning when you put the whole country in jail? Like eventually you're going to run out of people to put in prison and then to fill all those other spots too. And what happens then? And yeah, I don't think there's a clear picture of that at all. All right. A couple other things we want to hit while we still got time here. And this kind of circles back to our less the politics, but maybe the impacts of other dynamics in life that can still influence what's going on. And we're going to revisit our Russian pop star, who I think we've talked about a couple times now.
Alla
And
Pugacheva.
yes, so we mentioned a couple episodes ago she might have snuck one in on one of the Russian state media news show hosts because he didn't look too good on one of his interviews. But I think it was the day before yesterday. My timeline is right. She put out a very strong public statement about what Putin was doing and about the war. And if you want to kind of summarize that and give us some of the impacts of it.
Yes, so I'm trying quickly enough to find the quote, but what she says, so in short, whether I can find it quickly or not, is her husband. So Russia has this foreign agent law, and so the foreign agent law basically means that anytime you make any sort of public statement or you interact with anyone, you have to let them know that you're a foreign agent. And obviously, this makes you sound like a spy. So Alla Pugacheva and her husband Maxim Galkin, um, so also, who is this woman? Why is she like an important person? The way that I've described it is basically like Dolly Parton. I've also seen it described as like Edith Piaf for like French people. But if you had like Dolly Parton and like Oprah, so someone who transcends time and space. She's been an extremely popular person for 50 years. She has like millions of followers on all social media. She's had, prizes from the Soviet state going back to like the Brezhnev years. This person is an institute herself. She's also had like several husbands. She's a very colorful person, super talented. Her latest, and sort of maybe like Elizabeth Taylor in a sense, like her latest husband. Her latest husband is also like a super popular entertainer. And he's been super hard against this war and the effects that it has on both Ukrainian people and Russian society. And so he was placed on this foreign agent list. So she came out with an Instagram statement, which is basically like, the how people talk these days, and said that she wants to be placed on this list too, saying that this war is bad for society. This war is basically grinding up the lives of basically like the young people for the illusions of the very few. And it really came into, the old phrase of it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. That's what she pointed to. She didn't mention anything about Ukraine or Ukrainians, a little more sort of careful or circumspect compared to her husband. But what she did was she identified that what this is a war, and what this war is doing, it's going to break Russia in the end. So obviously within hours, she was placed under investigation. That will proceed apace. But in a certain sense, this was by far the most popular person in Russia to come out against the war. And I think, you can't overdetermine why did Putin and his team decide on like the annexations, mobilizations, etc. Because like obviously battlefield is like the biggest. Humiliation in Uzbekistan second biggest. But the idea that people could then say if Alla Pugacheva is against it, it then goes against in essence, the thing that the Kremlin's wanted over this entire conflict, which is for people who are not participating to just give the thumbs up, put the lapel on their Z pin on their lapel, and just ignore everything. If the most popular entertainer in the country suddenly is coming out against it, how many more people could that motivate to basically not support the war? And so that's just part of the mix of what's going on right now in terms of basically the public sentiment within Russia.
Yeah. I think maybe we may need to have a little segment here or mini segment where we kind of follow her status and see what she's up to, because um, maybe as a bellwether, I don't know, it'd be something worth devoting some attention to, especially if she's already crossed the line. There's no takebacks. I would think she's crossed this line. No reason not to sort of speak her mind from now on. As long as you can avoid any windows in the process. So last thing I want to hit, we'll have still a couple minutes here, is we've talked about the Russian state media and their messaging before, and they're always very colorful and in some interesting characterizations that come out of them. But in the last 24 hours, what are some of the hot takes you've been seeing on the main sort of Russian state media channels that sort of what do they indicate about the reception of this mobilization?
Oh, super hot takes from Russian talk shows are, this is the game changer. There's been several game changers before, but this is the one, because this is Russia finally, after 7 months, getting serious about fighting, which is the only, arrow they have in their quiver. Nuclear extortion. That's the thing. So, hot takes. This will make the West basically give up support to, its proxy Ukraine, and therefore Russia is going to basically fulfill all the objectives of the special military operation. The supranationalists are super enthusiastic about the usage of nuclear weapons, because at this point there is that portion of Russian society, and particularly these like super hardcore fascists who are interested in the genocide of Ukrainian people. Like that is like their main thing. Um, and obviously the enthusiasm that this mobilization, you know, sort of echoes of 1930s here and of Stalin times, is that this is going to be the opportunity for society to come together, and those who don't come together are going to meet basically the jackboot in their face, the riot police taking them away, and that basically all the dissidents, traitors, and weaklings will be identified for who they are. So sort of the cleansing of the body politic is another sort of like strong fascist talking line, but that's where basically Russian talk shows are right now.
Excuse me. Interesting point, that last one about the coming together, because it seemed that the first inclination of the sort of the Russian body politic was to get away, planes, trains, and automobiles as best they could after the announcement came out. So, I don't know. Maybe it's may not be the unifying force that they think it is, but I guess if you close off the borders and you have nowhere to go, that's one way to unify the body politic.
Yeah, so a lot of super enthusiastic people who don't have to do the fighting are very enthusiastic about others doing the fighting.
Indeed, and that would not be the first time in a larger conflict, human history. Indeed. All right, Yuval. Well, I think we've hit the time that we have here. We are certainly grateful for you basically burning the midnight oil and the early morning oil to scroll through all the stuff as it was coming out and give us an assessment on it. And as always, tempo will dictate when we do these things, but there's a lot to watch right now, a lot of different things in motion, and it's only been the first 24 hours since Putin finally took this step that he'd been putting off for months. So we'll be watching.
What a week the day has been.
Yes, there's some phrase about there's like decades where weeks of history happen, and then there's weeks where decades of history happen, and I don't know if we've hit quite that level of hyperbole yet with this particular development. But it is significant because we talked about it a lot. It's something he did not want to do. We knew that, and he's finally had to bite the bullet and do it.
And it's only Wednesday.
And I believe the first referenda are scheduled for Friday. Is that right?
Yeah, they're going to start Friday.
something else to watch. Yuval, thank you very much, and thank you to our audience again for listening through this. We'll bring you another episode here as things develop.
Trails.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.